Welcome to Beyond the Veil. Let's get started, shall we? When I was younger, I used to stay at my grandparents' farm a lot. They had a big 60-acre farm, and their house was nestled about a quarter mile into the woods. One summer night, we all went to bed, but I had trouble falling asleep. I was the only one awake and had just come back from the bathroom to join my cousin on the bunk bed. In the bedroom, there was one window facing a light post my grandparents had put up. As I was getting settled in bed, I noticed something strange. I saw shadows moving outside the window. It happened quickly, and I felt a bit scared already. I crawled out of bed and stayed close to the floor, creeping towards the window. I carefully peeked out above the window sill. Outside, I saw a figure casting a shadow on the curtain. It looked like a big dog with a long snout, a pointed tail, and ears. I was frozen in fear as it stopped right in the middle of the window frame, then slowly turned its head to face me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like a wolf's head on a human body. I watched in horror as it turned away and moved on. When I told people about this, they said I was young and maybe just had a nightmare. But I know what I saw, and I remember it very clearly. My mother had also stayed in that room as a child, so I asked her if she ever saw anything strange. She hesitated for a while and then shook her head, saying no. She knew the folklore and didn't want to talk about it, so we dropped the subject. I can't explain what I saw, but it scared me deeply. Even now, I still feel uneasy about being alone at night in that place. Just writing this story gave me goosebumps. I never used to believe in mythical creatures, but something happened that made me rethink that. It was last Monday when I was walking in the woods behind my house. It was 5 in the afternoon, and the sun was still shining brightly. Suddenly, I heard an incredibly loud thump on the ground, like the sound of a huge bull running. I was curious, so I hurried to get a glimpse, thinking it might be a deer. But what I saw surprised me. It looked like a person, but it was very dark, maybe because of the shadows. It was a bit skinny, and I thought it had horns. But I couldn't be sure. Before I could get a good look, it ran off so quickly, like a person running at full speed. I wasn't scared at the moment because I had a gun with me, but I decided to turn back and head home. As I was walking home, I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw. I kept looking over my shoulder, just in case. Whatever it was, it didn't make any noise. It was completely silent as it ran away. When I got home, I called my friend and told him everything. I had taken a shotgun with me that day for safety, but I still couldn't shake off the eerie feeling. My brother also shared a strange encounter he had within the past year. He was outside at night with our dad in the driveway when he saw something peculiar. It was hunched over, had pointy ears, no hair, and had a grayish color. It ran really fast, about 30 miles per hour, just 10 feet away from him, from one corner of the house to a nearby car. But when he went to look, there was nothing there. It was all too quiet, and even our dad didn't hear or see anything unusual. What my brother saw was different from what I saw. But I believe him. It makes me wonder how long these strange creatures have been out there. I'm really creeped out now and don't want to go back into those woods anytime soon. I understand if you find it hard to believe, but just a week ago, I would have thought the same about stories like this. But after what I experienced, I can't ignore it anymore. I'm just looking for some help to understand what I saw. While walking my dog late at night, far away from anyone, I experienced something spine-chilling. I heard a faint whisper of my name coming from the woods, thinking it was just my imagination. However, moments later, I heard it again. And shockingly, my dog seemed to notice the direction of the sound too. This scared me so much that it caused goosebumps all over my body. Without wasting any time, I turned around and walked away from the eerie place. On other occasions, during late-night walks in the woods, I remember hearing what sounded like babies crying. My grandmother once shared stories with me about creatures known as the kushtaka, which bear an uncanny resemblance to the skinwalkers referred to by natives in Alaska. She told a story where she was hunting with her husband and heard her name being called from the woods, even though her husband was safely inside the cabin. It's remarkable and unsettling how these stories have persisted for years. Every summer since 2012, I've been going to a sleepaway camp in Lake Como. The camp is quite big, with around 4,000 kids attending, and it has a good reputation. However, in the past 5 years, some strange and spooky things have happened there. For instance, one of the skate instructors went insane and got sent to an asylum. The camp owner had a terrible accident, and demonic symbols were found carved into the burn pit. But apart from these creepy incidents, the camp is pretty normal, with kids doing regular camp stuff like sneaking out and having fun. During my final summer at the camp in 2021, I decided to make the most of it and sneak out as much as possible. I found a little path through the woods behind my cabin that was rarely used, and it led up to a pavilion at the top of the camp where I could get phone reception without getting caught. For 3 nights, I walked up that path, but each time I had an uneasy feeling, as if I was being watched and that something bad might happen. I tried to convince myself it was just the presence of animals like bears that made me feel that way. But on the 3rd night, the feeling of impending doom was so strong that I stayed at the pavilion with my flashlight on until sunrise before heading back to the cabin. The next night, 2 guys invited my friend and me to smoke with them. We decided to go, and with my friend by my side, I felt much better and less scared. As we were walking to the canteen, a dark figure appeared at the end of the hallway. We joked around at first, assuming it was just a counselor or the guys we were meeting. But when we got closer and shone our flashlights on the figure, it ran into the bathroom. We waited outside the bathroom, but there was no sound or sign of anyone being inside. After a while, we decided to go in. But there was no one there, and the room was pitch black. My friend, who doesn't believe in supernatural stuff, got scared and told me to run. We went back to the cabin, and my friend seemed really frightened. She mentioned that when we shone our flashlights on the figure, she couldn't see any details, like clothing or features, just the outline of a person. That night, I couldn't sleep, and I kept thinking it might have been my mind playing tricks on me due to the darkness and exhaustion. It felt like seeing shadows out of the corner of your eye when you haven't slept enough. The camp's reputation had been impacted by several eerie incidents in recent years, which created an on-edge atmosphere. But despite those happenings, the camp continued to run like any other, with kids enjoying their summer activities. As I walked through the woods on my secret path, the sense of being watched intensified with each step. I tried to convince myself that it was just the animals around me causing the unease, but deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. The 3rd night was the worst, as an overwhelming feeling of dread filled my entire being, and I could barely move from the pavilion for fear of encountering whatever lurked in the darkness. One night, my friend and I were invited to join some guys for a late-night smoke session. Having my friend with me provided some comfort, and I was less afraid. As we made our way to the canteen, the hallway seemed eerily empty and dark. We spotted a figure at the far end, and at first, we joked about who it might be. However, as we approached, the figure stood still, refusing to answer our calls. The fear in the air grew as we moved closer, and our flashlights revealed nothing but a silhouette. The figure darted into the bathroom, and we waited for some sign of life. But there was nothing, no sounds, no movement. Eventually, we decided to enter, only to find the room completely empty, with no trace of anyone being there. We hurried back to the cabin, and my usually skeptical friend was genuinely terrified. She couldn't explain how the figure remained pitch black even in the beam of our flashlights, devoid of any details or features. What happened that night left us shaken, and I struggled to sleep, wondering if it was all just a product of my imagination. Now, years later, I still remember that summer and the inexplicable events that took place at the camp. The memories haunt me, and even though I've moved on, a part of me still thinks if there was more to those encounters than I could ever understand. My partner and I just got back from a long camping trip in Arizona and ended up in the Kaibab National Forest, where this spooky encounter happened. We spent the whole day driving and off-roading on the forest roads, trying to find the perfect camping spot near the north rim of the Grand Canyon. As it got darker, my partner started to get frustrated. We promised ourselves to camp at the end of the next trail we find. Unfortunately, that trail led us to an area devastated by a fire last summer. Most of the trees were gone, and it felt eerie. But we decided to make the best of it and set up our camp. As we were hanging out by the fire after dinner, we heard some snapping branches in the woods. We grabbed our flashlights to see if anything was there, but we couldn't spot anything. Just in case, I picked up my shotgun. We were trying to be as quiet as possible, listening carefully to the sounds of the woods. The night was clear, but without the moon, it was very dark outside the fire's reach. Then, we heard a soft whisper, like a woman's voice. We strained our ears to make out the words, but it sounded like a language we didn't understand. Soon after, the whisper turned into crying, and then wailing, as if someone was in immense pain. We were absolutely terrified by this point. The wailing eventually stopped. But we felt unwelcome and the air turned very cold. We immediately knew this was a strange and paranormal experience. We weren't sure if it was a skinwalker or maybe just a ghost. But whatever it was, it left us feeling frightened and confused. Recently, during one of our regular nightly bike rides, my mom had a scary encounter. While she was cycling with her headphones on, she came across a dark and open area on the trail. She noticed movement and heard a loud yell that really scared her. What made it weird was the fact people stayed away from this area as trees were dried out and shrubs were non-existent. This past weekend, we went on a bike ride on the same trail, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. My entire body felt on edge. And my instincts were telling me to leave the place as quickly as possible. My mom seemed to be taking her time until she spotted eyes in the distance. My bright light allowed me to get a closer look at whatever was watching us from the tree line, and the sight was something I can't describe. All that mattered at that moment was getting out of there as fast as we could. This sight has put us on edge and we try to stay away from that trail as much as possible. It was a chilly, mid-October night in 1992 when I was riding my motorcycle home after visiting friends in California. The time was late in the evening, almost early morning, and the road I was on was dimly lit. There was no other cars in sight. And the road was surrounded by groves on both sides, with distance in darkness. As I rode along at around 50 miles per hour, I noticed a jogger up ahead on my right side. It seemed strange to see someone jogging in this deserted area at this time of year and night. I moved to the middle of the road, giving the jogger some space, and turned on my bright headlights to make sure they saw me coming. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, just a hooded figure in heather gray sweats, about 6 feet tall, jogging along the deserted county road at midnight in October. But as I got closer, something bizarre happened. The figure stumbled and fell to the ground, but instead of getting up like a regular jogger, it quickly got on all fours and began running, like a wild animal. I was taken aback and shifted into a higher gear, trying to get away from this strange sight. It was keeping pace with my motorcycle for a moment, as if it sensed I had noticed it. Then, it abruptly ran into the dark walnut grove on its right. This really scared me, and I pushed the throttle hard, reaching 100 miles per hour in no time. I couldn't shake the image of that hooded creature possibly reappearing in my rearview mirror with a horrifying, twisted face. It felt like an eternity before I finally looked back, and to my relief, there was nothing behind me, just darkness. I continued on, my heart pounding, and finally arrived home. Even now, after 30 years, I can tell this true story, but many listeners find it hard to believe. Some trust me, while others remain skeptical. But that night will always stay with me, haunting my memories. When I was around 10 years old, I visited my grandma's house in rural Nebraska. One night, while I was doing some chores outside, an eerie feeling suddenly rushed over me, sending chills down my spine. I couldn't shake it off. I felt the need to look towards the tree line about 70 yards away, and to my horror, I saw a pale face peering at me from the thick bushes. Scared, I immediately rushed back to the house and avoided going outside for the remainder of the night. The next morning, I went outside with my sister and some cousins, forgetting about what happened the night before. As we were walking in the general direction where I had seen the face, I separated from the group to relieve myself. I saw a deer, but it looked strange, almost hollow and lifeless. I can't explain it, it just didn't look like what you would expect from a living being. The deer locked eyes with me, which really scared me. I quickly ran back to the group and told them to get back to the house. For the rest of my stay, I avoided going outside altogether. However, one of my cousins later told me that they heard a woman's voice calling out to them from the woods, adding to the chilling atmosphere around my grandma's house. I live in Australia, but I have Native American ancestry. It was a typical autumn day, and I decided to hang some clothes outside on the clothesline under the carport, which is attached to the side of my house. As the day was coming to an end, the daylight was fading quickly. But I wanted to finish hanging the last load of washing for the day. As I stepped outside, I began to feel an unsettling and uneasy sensation. At first, I thought it was just the encroaching darkness making me feel a bit on edge. However, as I continued hanging the clothes, the feeling intensified, and I started to get the distinct sense that I was being watched. It felt like eyes were fixed on me from somewhere nearby, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. Suddenly, I heard screams from a group of kids playing up the street. The screams were loud. But then everything fell silent. I tried to dismiss it as kids just being kids, but the eerie feeling persisted. The air grew colder, and the usual sounds of crickets and bugs in the evening seemed to vanish. It was like nature itself had gone quiet, as if sensing something strange. As I moved the clothes rack outside the carport to make use of the last traces of daylight, I noticed something odd. A section of the dense garden that encircled our U-shaped driveway looked trampled and disturbed, about 13 feet of it. It was strange because I hadn't seen anything in the garden before. The feeling of being watched intensified, and then I heard a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. It was a growl unlike any I had ever heard before. It had a canine-like quality. But there was something deeply unsettling and unnatural about it. It didn't sound like a typical animal growl, it was more sinister and foreboding. The growling was accompanied by an increasing feeling of dread. And I felt like I needed to get back inside the safety of my home as quickly as possible. I finished hanging the clothes, scanning the surroundings nervously. The air was thick with an unexplained tension. Once I was back inside, my indoor cat, who had been eager to go outside earlier, acted strangely. She was skulking around, with all her fur puffed up, and she seemed on edge. It was unusual behavior for her, and it added to the eerie atmosphere in the house. Our home is surrounded by bushland and is located next to a river behind us. While the natural surroundings are beautiful, I've always had a lingering feeling that someone or something might be lurking in the shadows. I used to enjoy fishing in the nearby river, but that feeling of being watched made me stop. The growl I heard outside was unlike anything I have experienced in the countryside. I've encountered wild dogs, foxes, and other animals, but this was different. It sounded close to a dog's growl, but there was an unsettling and unnatural quality to it that I can't quite explain. All in all, it was a chilling and unnerving experience that left me questioning what might be out there, hidden in the darkness and shadows of the surrounding woods and river. Late one night, around midnight, I was on my porch smoking in the silence of the night. Suddenly, the trees in the nearby forest began shaking violently, freaking me out a little bit. Within moments, a deep and terrifying shriek, sounding like a cat's scream but much deeper, pierced the silence. Even though I couldn't see, I did see the trees swaying and moving. As the sounds continued, I then heard something sprinting with surprising speed on all fours. The fast and heavy steps it took made it clear that whatever it was, must have been massive. To my surprise, it ran across the field next to a neighboring house in less than 2 seconds, covering a distance of over 100 meters. The experience left me scared, as the way it moved and screamed didn't sound like anything I had ever come across before. A few years ago, my brother and I were on a massive ranch in Kuna, Idaho, covering about 18 sections of rugged land with clay hills and deep canyons. The ranch was mainly unfenced and had a rich history, including buffalo jump sites and rumors of a historic massacre. 2 abandoned homesteads, the Mint and Carter places, also added to the eerie vibe. In 2017, after a well was drilled on the property, strange things started happening. Hunters reported being stalked by wolves, even though wolves hadn't been seen there for decades. We also began losing cattle, and 138 of them went missing since 2017, causing significant financial losses. One incident in October 2020 stood out. While gathering cattle with my brother and nephew, we heard eerie howls in a canyon, and my usually calm horse, Ace, was spooked. Later, I encountered a massive black wolf-like creature near the Carter homestead, but I brushed it off as a coyote. That evening, I faced more bizarre events. My horse trailer mysteriously broke, and I left Ace at the corrals overnight. The next morning, the corrals were in disarray, and the cattle and Ace were gone. Searching for Ace, we found strange holes dug by someone and a disturbing bone pile, with bones stacked up. 3 days later, we found Ace's mutilated carcass at the bottom of a sinkhole, along with 3 cows. Their mutilations were puzzling, and no tracks led to or from the sinkhole. The authorities couldn't explain it and assumed the cattle ran there in a panic. My concerns about the wolf I saw were dismissed. After this incident, we continued experiencing strange occurrences, and more cattle went missing. We ride the ranch in pairs now, and we might consider terminating the lease due to the ongoing cattle losses. The ranch remains a mysterious and eerie place, with unexplained events that still haunt me to this day. A few years back, I moved to a new house located in the middle of a wooded area, where there were plenty of animals. I was familiar with most of the wildlife sounds in the area, but a few months after moving in, I started hearing a strange noise at night. It sounded like a mix between a screeching child and a wounded rabbit. At first, I thought it was just one of those odd noises you hear now and then in the wilderness. But then, it started happening every single night, which made me uneasy. I tried to brush it off and ignore it. But things got weirder when I checked my trail cams. These cameras take 3 pictures whenever they detect movement. At first, I noticed some strange sets of pictures. For example, there would be a coyote in the first frame, and then a rabbit would appear in the next frame, following closely behind the predator. That didn't make any sense in terms of a predator-prey relationship. But it didn't end there. Later on, I started getting pictures of a mysterious black blur zipping across the frame. This blur would only show up in one of the 3 pictures taken when the camera was triggered. It baffled me, and I couldn't explain what it was. I talked to some of my neighbors, and they mentioned rumors about an Indian burial ground nearby, since the area intersects the Trail of Tears. They suggested it could be possible. I don't know if that has anything to do with the strange occurrences, but it's a chilling thought. Something else that's been happening is when I go to check my trail cams, I take the same route each time. However, I end up in a completely different spot each time I check them. I don't know if it's because of skinwalkers or just my own paranoia, but it has me wondering if anyone out there might have some answers to these mysteries. This happened more than 2 decades ago when I was still in high school. One day, my sister and I talked about skinwalkers, sharing stories we had heard from friends and their families' encounters with these eerie beings. That very night, as I was peacefully sleeping, my dreams suddenly stopped, leaving me in complete darkness and silence. It was as if my ears became alert while the rest of my body remained in slumber. Shortly after this, I heard a weird sound of bare feet approaching my window, followed by a loud bang, and then the sound of footsteps running into the distance, maybe around 30 feet away. As the running sound faded, I opened my eyes, was fully awake, and my body was shaking uncontrollably for about 10 seconds. Eventually, I managed to calm myself and fall back asleep. The next day, I talked to my sister about the strange dream, only to find out that she had been woken up during the night by something scratching at her window around the same time. Although she didn't experience the same shivering, we both agreed that it was creepy. From that point on, we decided never to openly talk skinwalkers again. As the experience left us with an eerie feeling we preferred not to revisit. Several years ago, my family moved to a small neighborhood surrounded by a forest in Rochester. I watched many horror movies, which played to my paranoia, especially around the woods. To keep our old dog company, we got a new one, Steven, who was lively and energetic. Unfortunately, our old dog passed away, leaving Steven as our only pet. A few years later, my parents got divorced, and my mom began spending some days with us while the other days were spent elsewhere. My mom's native background made her familiar with stories about skinwalkers and wendigos. One day, as she was driving up a road near our neighborhood, she saw a tall, gray-skinned figure with deer hooves for feet walking into the woods. This sighting scared her, and she quickly drove back to our house. Her encounter with the possible wendigo fueled my paranoia. However, despite my fear, I went on a bike ride near the hill where she saw the creature, but my gut feeling warned me to be cautious. I decided to turn around when I got to the hill, as I couldn't help but to feel watched the entire time I was there and driving back. One night, I let Steven out on a leash to go to the bathroom. As he started barking at something in the dark, I called him back inside. However, he continued barking, and when I looked into the darkness, I saw shining eyes heightened by the porch light. Fearing for Steven's safety, I pulled him inside and locked up the house, ensuring every window was covered. Since that, I've maintained a routine of closing blinds, locking doors, and turning off outside lights after dark. When outside, I now prefer being in a group or having a weapon with me for added security. I want to share a spooky experience I had one night. It was late, and I was in bed trying to fall asleep, but I couldn't, so I decided to watch some scary videos on my phone. I was up until around 3:30 a.m. and I spent 4 hours watching those videos. After watching them for a while, I started feeling really scared and anxious, like there was something in my room with me. In those videos, people mentioned that when something strange was around, they heard 3 knocks. Just then, I heard a knock on my door, and it made my heart race. A few moments later, there was another knock, and I thought to myself, if I hear one more, I'll totally freak out. But as if it knew my fear, a third knock came, and I felt frozen with terror. I couldn't bring myself to look at the door. As I lay there, I suddenly heard whispering. But it was only in my right ear. The whispering sounded like a fast, strange language I had never heard before. It felt like someone or something was watching me from the doorway. I was so scared that I couldn't move for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only about 10 minutes. Eventually, the whispering slowly faded away, and I felt a bit relieved. Finally, I managed to fall asleep, but that night left me feeling really spooked. Since then, I've been really scared. I don't watch scary videos alone or at night anymore. And when I'm home alone, I make sure to keep my gun close to make me feel safer. It's something I can't forget, and it's made me more cautious when I'm in my room at night. This story happened in August 2018 when my brother and I were traveling from the East Coast to the West Coast. We decided to stay near Phoenix, Arizona, during our journey to visit his old friends. One evening, after crossing into Arizona from New Mexico around 10 p.m., we noticed road signs about an escaped convict. It felt a bit eerie, but we laughed and joked about it. We both commented on how Arizona can feel mysterious, and my brother mentioned something about not mentioning skinwalkers to avoid any spookiness. He told me about a superstitious friend who warned him not to discuss skinwalkers when the topic came up. As we drove along Interstate 40, our phone signal became patchy, and we lost navigation and Spotify due to poor connectivity. We saw signs for Petrified Forest National Park and continued into the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, something darted in front of our car, and I had to hit the brakes. At first, we thought it was a deer because of its long neck and thin legs, but as we got a closer look, we were perplexed. Its body was long and cat-like, with a cougar-like tail and a wolfish head with short ears. The creature moved in an unnatural way, and we screamed as it disappeared over the guardrail on the other side of the road, vanishing into the desert. After the initial shock, we started laughing hysterically, trying to make sense of what we had just witnessed. We couldn't explain what we saw but described it as a deformed cougar with mange. The experience was surreal and still gives me chills when I think about it. When I was around 10 years old, my family decided to take a road trip through the southwestern part of the country, exploring places in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. During our journey, we stayed at a budget-friendly cabin somewhere between Alamogordo and Roswell. The area surrounding the cabin was dense with trees, and it took us about 20 minutes to reach a small gas station to get food for the night. The cabin had 2 bedrooms and a living room. My parents took the larger bedroom, my younger sister got the other one, and I slept on the pull-out couch. The couch was positioned next to a big window overlooking a creek that led into the woods. One night, while everyone was asleep, I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of knocking on the window. I was too terrified to turn around and look. The knocking wasn't random. It followed a rhythm, almost like a waltz with long pauses, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I lay there, trying not to make any noise, and then the outside sound changed. It turned into a quiet, high-pitched whistle, which made my fear intensify. I couldn't control my panic and started screaming for my dad. My dad immediately rushed into the room. He's not someone who believes in supernatural things, and he claims he didn't see anything, but he said he felt an eerie sense of unease that he had never experienced before. He woke up my sister, and we all slept together in the larger bedroom that night. The next day, I checked outside the window and noticed large deer tracks leading right up to it. Despite our similar trips afterwards, my dad refused to return to that specific area again. Two weeks ago, I was feeling a bit down during a bonfire gathering with my buddies in Kuna, Idaho. I decided to cheer myself up by taking a night ride on my dirt bike alone on some trails. I rode about 3 miles from the fire and went up a hill where I stayed for around 45 minutes. There was no one else around, and I enjoyed the solitude. However, as time passed, I started hearing laughter nearby. It sounded like there were 2 or 3 people giggling. The laughter was intermittent, happening every 5 minutes, and it kept getting closer. I began to feel like I wasn't alone anymore, which made me a little uneasy. I tried to start my bike to head back to the bonfire, but it wouldn't cooperate. After a few attempts, I managed to start it downhill, but it was running poorly and kept stalling. I had to rev the engine to keep it going while slowly heading back to the fire. It was strange because I usually ride much faster, but that night, I felt really scared for no apparent reason. As I rode back, I thought I saw shadowy figures in the corner of my eyes. But they disappeared whenever I looked directly at them. Eventually, I made it back safely to the bonfire, and nothing else unusual happened that night. However, later on, my buddies mentioned Skinwalker stories in that same area, and it got me thinking. The laughter. My bike's trouble starting, the uneasy feeling, and the shadow figures I saw all seemed similar to things from other stories they mentioned. It was a strange night, and I can't help but wonder what might have been out there with me that night. I don't know what to believe. But it was definitely an experience that left me with a lingering sense of mystery and caution. Over the past few months, something strange has been happening in our house, particularly at night. It has only been seen twice and seems to target women and anyone under 18, like my best friend's little brother who is 16. The first time I saw it, it was at sunset. Standing in the woods, really tall and pale with blonde hair and wearing a black shirt. Its face was not visible, and it had unusually long arms. When I told it to leave, it spun around and disappeared quickly. My best friend's mom saw the same thing, but with jeans and taller. It was in the same area I saw it, but this time during sunrise. Since then, whenever I go outside at night, it mimics my voice and the voices of others in the same area. We also hear strange noises, which we think are supposed to sound like animals. But they don't quite match any animals we know. Last week, I saw a shadow outside my window that looked like a hunched-over person with something sticking out of its head and a snout. My best friend's little brother experiences tapping on his window at night, even though his window is about 15 feet off the ground. Last night, as I was leaving for a late-night Walmart run, I heard something screaming and crying. When I called for my best friend, it stopped, and no one else heard it. This confirms that it is watching us. We are not sure why this is happening, as we don't believe we have upset anyone. None of us are Native Americans, but we live near a museum run by the descendants of the Mississippian Indians, which used to be their home many years ago. This whole situation is really eerie and has left us all feeling unsettled and unsure of what's going on. We hope to find some answers soon. Let me share a spooky story that happened to me and my girlfriend. We live in an apartment complex on the outskirts of town in Illinois, and right next to us is a wooded area teeming with coyotes, deer, and birds. It's always lively there. One night, around 3 a.m., my girlfriend went outside to get a case of water from the trunk of our car. As she was grabbing the water, she claimed she heard a voice coming from the woods. It was a girl's voice saying, "Hello?" She was confused but replied back with a hesitant, "Hello." But then, things got creepy. The voice asked, "Can somebody help me?" My girlfriend got chills all over her body and ran back to our house as fast as she could. As she reached the door, she heard the voice again, but this time, it sounded like the girl's voice was getting closer, but it wasn't normal anymore. It sounded strange, almost like it wasn't real. She couldn't explain the change in the voice, and strangely, she felt like the voice was familiar, but she couldn't figure out whose voice it was. I believed her because in the 2 years we've lived here, we've never talked about anything like this happening before. When she rushed inside, she looked shocked and was breathing heavily, as if she had seen something terrifying or heard a loud noise. She thinks it might have been a skinwalker because who would be out at 3 a.m. asking for help in the woods? We're both puzzled and spooked by this strange encounter. The woods next to our apartment complex have always been a bit mysterious. But this incident has left us wondering about the unknown and unexplained. Thank you for listening. If you managed to stick to the end, comment a ghost emoji. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Maybe share with friends who also like the spooks. I'll see you in the next video.